Hi, everyone. All right, I think we can get started. Great. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's panel conversation on policy over politics, bridging differences to make democracy work. My name is Ishrat Aishi, and I am an alum of both Up to Us and CGIU. And I wanted to share a little bit since joining both Up to Us and later as part of my commitment to action with CGIU. I wanted to reflect a little bit and say that if there's anything I've learned during my time across both of these organizations, it's really that the most important conversations are sometimes a little difficult, but they're also often the ones that carry the most weight. And when we talk about the importance of fiscal policy, bipartisanship, economic development, or a myriad of other topics, it's oftentimes that we grow when we're having these difficult conversations. And so being part of both CGIU and Up to Us has allowed me to dive headfirst into these conversations in which I have definitely grown in a multitude of ways. So that said, I'm so very excited for this conversation that we're going to be having today, where we are bringing together members of both the Up to Us and CGIU alumni communities. And we'll highlight some of the incredible ways that these members are taking action around the US to help bridge the partisan divides in support of sound policies. So following this conversation, please be sure to join us for a networking event with some of our panelists to continue this conversation and discuss some of the ways that young people can stay engaged. And now I'm honored to introduce our moderator for this conversation, someone who works each day with the Clinton Foundation and its partners to help create economic opportunity, improve public health, and inspire civic engagement and service around the US and across the world. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming the Vice Chair of the Clinton Foundation, Chelsea Clinton.
Ishrat, thank you for that very warm welcome, and thank you all for joining us this evening. We're incredibly proud and excited to have so many Up to Us and CGIU alums with us this evening, some of whom I know are double alums, just as Ishrat is. I want to also just say how proud we are at CGIU that we've worked now for almost a decade with the Peterson Foundation to support Up to Us in your really, I think, critical and very unique work across the country to help engage people, young people especially, in kind of the conversation and the work of ensuring that as we think about how to build a sustainable future, we think about kind of fiscal and economic sustainability as part of that. So just thank you all again for being with us. And I know that we have a lot of stuff to cover. So I want to invite our panelists onto the screen. Still almost 2 years into COVID, I'm always want to say like onto the stage. And I'm like, no, onto the screen. And really just jump into the conversation. And I will try to remember to introduce each of the panelists while asking the first question. But if I forget, or if I forget a part of your biography that you would want to be included, please, of course, take the time to share kind of with everyone kind of what you think it's important for them to know about you, about your areas of focus, about your kind of expertise, and hopefully why you're excited to be part of this conversation. So Ben, I see you on the screen. I saw you kind of come on first. And I know that you're the director of the Progressive Policies Institute Center for Funding America's Future. I had to read that to make sure that I got it, all the right words in the right order. And I know that you develop policy proposals kind of from a progressive perspective to strengthen public investments in kind of the foundation of our economy and to ensure that our economy is more kind of equitably inclusive, especially as we think about growth and the future. Maybe you could just start by sharing a little bit about how you got involved in this work and why you think it is so important that kind of the discipline of economics, kind of also the discipline of thinking about fiscal sustainability be part of our thinking about how to build a sustainable and more equitable future for everyone.
Sure. So I first got involved in fiscal policy now, gosh, I guess it's been about a decade ago. when I had a presenter come to one of my college classes and give a presentation about the federal budget. I've always had an interest in politics and good public policy since I was a kid, but I wasn't sure exactly what area of public policy I wanted to work in. And the thing about the federal budget and public budgets in general, and I think President Biden has a quote that sums this up very well. It's don't tell me what you value, show me your budget and I'll tell you what you value. Budgets are a reflection of our values. How we decide to allocate resources shows what we want our government to look like. Everything that the government does is either through some sort of fiscal policy, tax or spending, or through regulatory policy. And so it really isn't, I found it to be an opportunity to address some of these broader questions about what do we want the long-term future of our society to look like. I think that, there's, from a young person's perspective, there's also a lot of concern about the way that our budget is currently constructed. We give a lot more resources towards, programs for older Americans and a lot less for young people and investments in the future. And so I started through college. After this presentation, I was part of the first Up to Us cohort, trying to educate my peers. We did a bipartisan campus campaign, and have just continued working through the budget and economic space, trying to put out proposals that show that we can have a budget that is both sustainable and progressive.
Great, thank you, Ben. And Yokindi, hopefully you'll be able to share a little bit about kind of why you founded Forefront and your work focused on ensuring that kind of public and private sector actors alike don't just think that diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts are kind of nice to have, but that are actually kind of really fundamental parts of how any entity should think about their work. So I don't see you on my screen, but hopefully you will appear and you can just share a little bit more about kind of why you felt compelled to found this organization and kind of what you're focused on now.
Thank you, Chelsea. Can you see me now?
Yes, I can see you.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm excited to be here today because it's a full circle moment for me.
My work wouldn't exist today if it wasn't for the Clinton Foundation, CGIU, and Up to Us, and starting right as a first year college student to now my full-time gig 4 years later post-graduation. Forefront started with a moment of obligation where I was called to contribute. It was July 5th, 2016. It was the summer before my senior year. I was doing this fancy consulting internship and I was on my way to work when I heard about the death of Alton Sterling out of Baton Rouge, Louisiana, another Black man being killed at the hands of the police. This wasn't new to me. I'm from Ferguson, Missouri. So the idea of seeing another name in another Black body like me and seeing it being like they didn't matter was a feeling that really crippled me, because I thought about my younger brothers and what could happen to them. While I look at my colleagues and my counterparts and their lives were left unchanged. All they had to worry about was changing a bullet point in the PowerPoint for one of our Fortune 500 clients. And so on that day, it's when I decided to focus on this mission of supporting employers and organizations on creating more equitable workplaces, so that this conversation around race didn't have to be the elephant in the room. And so today I spend my day doing bias training all the way from executives to students to racial equity audits to help essentially decolonize, change the foundation of our policies in our country so we can design better policies for the next generation to come.
Thank you. And now I want to also just acknowledge how extraordinary it is that, I think so often people do have a calling, Yokindi, and yet may not really be able to manifest it. And the fact that you had this calling and have now built an organization and you are now partnering with, I'm sure, some of the people who maybe were your clients when you were, a consultant is just, I think, incredibly inspiring, certainly for me, and I imagine for so many of the people who are watching us. Xavier, I think you are our college student, and certainly very much an important part of this conversation. And I know that so much of kind of the work that you do is helping your classmates, your cohort, on your campus have conversations and to create respectful, deliberative spaces where people can talk about things that they may not know as much about as they wish they did, like fiscal sustainability and what Ben was speaking about, or things that are really hard that they know they need to confront, like all of the work that Yilkindi's involved in and helping to lead. So maybe, Xavier, you could tell us a little bit about kind of how you create these deliberate spaces, and I think why you're optimistic that young people really can save our democracy.
Yeah, of course. I strongly believe that young people can save our democracy. It really does start with that generation. And I'm extremely optimistic, especially after partaking in many dialogues over the course of my time working with Deliberative Dialogues and NIFI. How I gained interest in this, it was actually in high school, which was about 5 years ago for me. It was in the year 2016 when politics kind of became the forefront of everything in my environment. It was background noise for a very long time until it wasn't. And I kind of had to formulate my opinion so I could start talking to other people, other 16-year-olds who didn't really know much more than I did, and I didn't know much myself. So all of us angry 16-year-olds had a bone to pick with one another because of some association, some political association. And I had found that many of my peers who were on opposing sides of different political parties had come to the conclusion that it's a lot easier to just not talk to somebody just because you disagree with them, because that's something that's easy to do, because that's safe. And so they feared talking to people that they disagreed with on politics because it just wasn't worth it for them, because it was uncomfortable and because it just wasn't safe. A great solution to that, I was actually invited by a professor named Dr. Tice to participate in the Center for Civic Engagement at my college, where we led these deliberative dialogues. Deliberative dialogues at their core are a conversation that are conversations that offer safe environments where participants can share their contrasting personal experiences. They can express their thoughts on different varying difficult topics, like topics that Kendi and Ben had mentioned earlier. And they, most importantly, they have time to reflect and find common ground on issues such as things like national debt, COVID-19, a functioning democracy, and many more topics. It's a time where participants can experience an environment that is unfortunately all too rare in our present day America.
Thank you. Xavier, and I want to certainly talk about what is all too rare in our present day America and how we try to move forward. I know that there are many people who are more cynical than you and certainly think, oh, well, if we have politicians attacking Big Bird, like how is it possible to have, fact-based conversations and debates that are kind of respectful of not only one another, but of kind of a shared commitment to building a better and brighter, a healthier and a more sustainable future. And so I guess, what I would want to ask each of you, because one of the many themes of the questions, at least that I received that I believe were submitted beforehand, were, how do we fight back against that cynicism? What are kind of the real points, as we were just hearing from Xavier talk about, where we can say, look, people are coming together and having real conversations, are able to really find meaningful common ground, to push forward. The hyper-partisanship, while also real, isn't the only story that's unfolding right now in America. And so I would just ask, maybe we'll start kind of, Ben, Yilkindi, and then, finish with you again, Xavier, talking about how do you push back against the cynics, and kind of where do you see optimism for young people, which all of you are, helping to get us back into what my father calls the solutions business?
So I think the first part of it is we have to be having the conversation to begin with. I think that one of the big drivers of hyper-partisanship and the division is that we've been self-sorting so much more than we have in the past, so much more than we have in the past, both in terms of where we decide to live. People live near people who share their values more than it used to be, where there was more intermingling, and also on social media and the internet, where we're able to create more of our own echo chamber. So I think a big part of it is getting out of that echo chamber, having discussions with people who you disagree with, trying to find those common ground and shared positions. And then I think it's also trying to approach these issues with a solutions mindset rather than an identity mindset, rather than having your identity and saying, I'm going to form my policy views based on that. Figure out what you think the ideal policies are first, and then let that shape your identity, and try to find common ground with people who have different views where you can.
Yokendi?
Yeah, there's this discussion today about politics versus policies. And,
A lot of good policies get turned away because they become too political. And I know this firsthand as a Afro-Latina Dominican immigrant to this country from the Midwest, smaller city. And I know a lot of my life is not politics, yet my experiences are often put for debate, with my body. My whole existence is in question. The hair that I'm wearing today, whether it's the curly hair you saw in my photo, in the flyer, or the protective style I'm wearing today, there's actual policies that says I can't wear my hair in this way in some institutions, in some spaces. Why is that? Who benefits from that? Well, the people in power do. My accent, my tongue, the fact that I'm an English language learner, and English is not my native language, has limited me from accessing some resources, capital. Why is that? ¿Por qué no puedo hablar en español con ustedes hoy? Why? Because those empowered benefit. So to do healing, we really have to have a real conversation about shifting power back to communities. But to do that, we have to build trust. So my day-to-day, I spend a lot of time on my own lifelong leadership journey and building really authentic relationships. It's gonna start real grassroots, and it's gonna take a long, long time, because that trust is not gonna come back right away due to the history in this country of slavery, racism, classism, and every ism in the book. We do need to address those systems head on.
Xavier?
Yeah, I just want to say that I love all this talk about having conversations, because that's all of what I do. Conversations are a fantastic starting point. If people don't have conversations, nothing gets solved. It's a tragedy that we see, or at least we think we see, a lot of our politicians just not wanting to have these conversations with their opposition, because they're only in favor of pleasing their constituents or their followers, and they decide to bend toward more radical sides, so they can appease those who are the loudest on their party. It's extremely dangerous. It's extremely dangerous. I think the first step to deconstructing hyperpartisanship is with our leaders, is having leaders that not only use more safe rhetoric, but choose their words carefully, and leaders who display a behavior that their followers can mimic and have a positive influence on all of America. But even before that, I'd say that it starts at an individual level, how we carry ourselves and how we interact with our environment and other people who may disagree with us. It's absolutely imperative that we have conversations where we put ourselves second, where we suspend our judgment. Just earlier, I was actually at the airport and I had a really long day. I just got off the plane and I sat down and I sat on a bench, and one of the bus attendants came up to me and asked me, if I was waiting for a hotel bus, which I was not. And I immediately assumed, oh, he wants me to get up and move. My entire attitude just dropped. And I looked at him and rolled my eyes and I was like, yeah, I'm not supposed to be here. And immediately he was like, no, it's perfectly fine. Please rest. And it's little things like that that remind you, don't jump to conclusions. Just because you're feeling a certain way, put that on the side. It's really not worth having a dispute that's not even there.
I think, good advice for all of us, especially over the last, 22 months of COVID. I do, Xavier, wanted though, kind of underscore something that you said, which is that we do ideally need our politicians, our elected leaders, to behave in a certain way. And I certainly, have found it incredibly troubling, that yesterday, a Republican congressman who I will not name, tweeted out and posted on Facebook and Instagram a horrific, very long meme, effectively, of him murdering his colleague, Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez, who is a representative, not too far north of where I live here in New York City. And that we have for quite a while now accepted effectively, kind of political violence in rhetoric that we know can become political violence, in fact, especially targeting women and particularly targeting women of color. And often because it's done in this sort of jovial, joking way, those of us who take it seriously are told, well, it was a satire. And I just, think I have maybe an old-fashioned belief that joking about killing someone is actually never a joke. And so I do think it's really important that even while we have this conversation here about how we all clearly believe it's important that we continue to talk to people with whom we have disagreements or different views about how to help move our country forward, that there are also things that we never sanitize, that we never whitewash, that we never kind of make acceptable or give kind of a platform to, which then leads me to my next question for all of you, because all of you are digital natives and I am not. So I was 7 when I got my first computer from Santa Claus. I still remember it. It was very exciting. And I remember when I got my first email account in high school. And I remember the first time I had to email in an assignment in college. All of this probably sounds like incredibly arcane to you. You're probably like, what is email? And I do think that our algorithms, kind of our social media and our kind of networked communities, as I think all of you have alluded to, have further segregated us and privileged and prioritized kind of anger and hate and meanness and crudity and things that I think are not actually productive for finding kind of areas of shared conversation. And so I'm just curious, in your different works, who've kind of been, as you're trying to engage people on kind of the importance of budgets, or you'll continue with all of your work on kind of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And Xavier, when you're trying to actually have people talk face to face and not kind of intermediated through a screen and an algorithm, how do you think about kind of bringing people into, even in these COVID times, kind of shared physical face-to-face conversations? How do you help people understand the ways in which they may be having more moments like Xavier courageously shared earlier, where he wasn't initially as kind to the man in the airport as he wished he would? And I think that's a perfect metaphor for how people often engage online. So how do you do the work that you are doing in a way that is mindful that so often people are meeting and gathering online, and yet we really need people to still meet and gather and debate together kind of face to face? So Ben, again, maybe we can just start with you, and then Yolkindi and Xavier.
Sure. I mean, I think that it really starts with trying to understand where the other person is coming from, understand whether, if you have a disagreement, is it because you have different values and you have different objectives, or that you have the same shared goal and you just disagree about how to get there. So in the instance in which you have different values, I find it's helpful to, whatever my policy is that I'm trying to advance, instead of framing it how it's going to accomplish my objectives, I try to frame it as how it is going to accomplish their objectives. And also when they tell me what they want, to try to be as receptive to that as possible and listen to their perspective. And then when it's an instance of we have the same values and just disagree about how to get there, I think that can be even easier. Then you're working towards a shared goal. You establish, the shared goal, and that you're trying to get to the same point, and you're making it more collaborative rather than combative. Is how I think about going about having those conversations and bringing people together.
And Yokindi?
Yeah, when I enter spaces as a woman of color, I stick out like a sore thumb. So I'm constantly thinking about my own Blackness, Latinidad, the way I carry myself. Identity is a continuous process for me when I'm constantly self-determining, iterating how I show up. And I think what's going to really make a difference is that for my white counterparts to also talk about their own identity, their own whiteness, their privilege. Because right now there's still that big myth. It's America is the land of opportunity. You work hard and everybody makes it. Everybody's starting in the same playing field. And so we're not having that same discussion. And again, it's hard to build that trust. So in a lot of the trainings I do with Forefront, we actually spend a lot of time talking about identity, and not just about race, but gender, sexual orientation, ability, education, socioeconomic status, again, intersectionality, a coin that was brought up by Kimberly Crenshaw, which is important that we all have interplay with systems in the US in a very different way. And that's important to talk about. So literally we spent the first 40 minutes, hour doing that, and a lot of executives are surprised with that because they're not used to spaces where they have to be humble, where they have to be vulnerable. They think they always have to be experts, have it all together. And that's why Gen Zers and a lot of the work we're talking about with young people, they're exciting because they're pushing us to be unapologetic, authentic, honest, super transparent, regardless of what party lines, wherever your beliefs are. Everybody's having more honest conversations with the TikToks. I have a little brother that's keeping me grounded. That's a true Gen Z. I'm borderline millennial, being born in 1995. And so that's what gives me hope for the future, because once we have that transparency, that honesty, that's when we're really going to start coming together as a society.
Xavier?
Yeah, I often find that when we have these dialogues, I don't think anybody ever says it, but I think that it's an underlying attitude that the person sitting across from you, or the person online, I should say, isn't a human, that they're just a point that you don't agree with. And it's much different when you're in person. For the lack of a more elaborate way of saying it, they become humanized because they're actual people. And now a lot of this stuff is transferred over Zoom. We had many deliberative dialogues, especially with the uprising of the pandemic, that were conducted over Zoom. But we did so over a platform called Common Ground for Action. And we paired it with Zoom, and it allowed us to have these difficult discussions online still. But one of the ground rules that I'd say really promotes deliberation is looking at each approach fairly, and not having political associations tied to specific solutions. So in our issue guides that we have 3 approaches to a single main issue. And those 3 approaches are just explained. They're not titled, or they're not placed in association with Democrat or Republican or conservative. Instead, they're just solutions. And we look at each actions that underline each of the solutions that we have offered. And so what we often find once we take a glance at our complete deliberation, that people agree with various actions underneath very differing overarching solutions to a single approach to a specific topic. So someone might the topic may be gun control, and they may be more in favor of restricting guns, but they also don't like the idea of limiting the amount of resources for people who maybe have mental disabilities. And that's just one of the solutions that can go about it. But they're all on three different parts of the same objective, which is to help save lives. People forget, like Ben mentioned, that just because you may have differing values or different ways of going about it, you may find yourself agreeing on what you want to achieve at the very end, and people forget that. I think the first step is remembering that.
I think that's very good advice, Xavier. I unfortunately believe that there are quite a few people in this country who admittedly don't share the view that I have for where we need to go or how we need to get there. But I do believe a majority share a view, even if we differ on how to get there, whether that is actively fighting climate change, actively investing in public health to ensure that we're better prepared for the inevitable next time against COVID-19, actively believing that no one in America should ever have to worry about lead in the water or a decaying bridge, believing in kind of gun violence prevention. We do have so many issues where 80 to 90% of the country agrees on what needs to happen big picture, and while there may be disagreement on the details. So while it is painful to think, oh my gosh, really, 10% of the country doesn't support any form of gun violence prevention, it is important to remember that 90% of the country supports quite a bit of what we know that could help save lives from kind of death by suicide or kind of homicide involving a gun. I certainly believe that voting should be easy in our country. I think everyone should be registered to vote when you turn 18. I think it's really, yay, happy birthday, and now you can vote. And I think certainly, really returning back to what Yilkindi was saying about the importance of building trust. I think if everyone voted, we would have more trust kind of in the political process, and ultimately then also in the outcomes, because we would have literally helped kind of enfranchise the people who were then going about hopefully deliberating and debating in a respectful way to kind of coalesce around various legislative priorities and then kind of the resulting legislation. And I know that despite huge efforts to ensure that young people are registered to vote and turn out to vote, especially in local state elections, we see a big drop in young voter turnout. We certainly saw that here in New York City in our local mayor's race. And so I just think it would be strange to not ask each of you how either in your own work you're encouraging young people to register to vote and vote, or kind of what you wish anyone listening would know about what you believe would work to ensure that more people were registered to vote and would turn out to vote in every election, among your generation, Yilkindi, whether you're, technically a millennial or a Gen Z. Because I think part of how we engage in the political process is hopefully ensuring we're getting access to good information, having conversations, including the hard conversations that, Xavier helps curate, and Yilkindi in the best sense sometimes help force. And I know Ben helps inform, but it also matters that people vote. So I wondered if you could each just share some thoughts about kind of about that question, and maybe we'll go in a slightly different order. Now, maybe Yilkindi, we can start with you and then go to Xavier and then go to Ben.
Yeah,
I was in the airport last week, and we had the elections going on in New York, and I was hearing the staff, the employees, all were talking and joking about not voting. And this was more of an older crowd, I would say, more the millennial side. And
I
the
love that you're
reasons-
like the millennials, like we're like the older crowd. Meanwhile, I'm a geriatric millennial. Which
Well,
I find
again,
so
I'm
painful.
identifying.
It's okay.
I'm
It's okay.
identifying
It's
with
okay. A moment of levity, Yilkindi. Sorry to interrupt.
I'm identifying with millennials in this case. So to clarify, and they were saying I don't trust these people. They're too corrupt. It was such a negative conversation about voting, and you can see that distrust. You can feel it is palpable. And I left with that thought, and honestly, I was sad that we still it's just not a norm. We don't believe it's going to lead to real policy change, to real actions. And so, I think about my brother just got his license, one of my other brothers, and it's normal for you to get your permit at 16 and the license at the latest 18. So, like you were saying, Chelsea, I think the earlier we educate folks about it and just make it part of our culture and reintroduce democracy again in a different way, and why it's more urgent than ever at this juncture as demographics are changing, that we do exercise our right to vote. But, at this point, some of the folks, it might be too late. So I think we're really got to take a step back and start grassroots with students that are in high school and middle school, and making sure that's part of the culture again. Because if obviously there's a lot of efforts that I admire on the ground that are getting folks to go out vote, even if it's last minute, and that's going to help. But we're just a long way to a real cultural change to rebuild that trust, even with a simple act as voting.
Xavier or Ben, any other thoughts that you would like to add?
Yeah, I'd say in short, remind people that their vote matters. I was registering people to vote for back in my freshman and sophomore year. It was a job that I had, and oftentimes I ran into a lot of people at the stand who would just walk past saying like, it doesn't matter, or like, my vote won't change anything anyways. I think that's an extremely toxic view on democracy, and it made me consider, why do people think that democracy is failing them? It's because of a lack of trust. It's everything they see with many of our mainstream media outlets, is all we see is a display of distrust, which is fairly warranted. I think that the solution to getting people to vote more is to make them believe that their vote matters by placing restrictions on politicians from doing things that are seemingly corrupt. Increasing transparency and building trust is the only way to get people to trust in democracy. You can't trust in your politicians that you voted into office or didn't, then you're not going to trust your opposition, and why even try?
Ben?
Yeah, I think there's a Senator Alan Simpson had a good quote on this. It was something like, if you don't show up at the table, you'll be on the menu. You have to, if you want your values to be considered by our elected officials, the thing they care about more than anything else is who shows up to vote, because that is ultimately what determines power in this country. I think to Xavier's quote, or Xavier's point about, showing people that it matters, I think about the specific examples in recent history where we've seen that one vote makes a difference. I mean, just as recently, really good example, in 2018 or 2017, the Virginia House of Delegates was up for re-election, the whole House, and it had a 2-to-1 Republican advantage. Nobody thought it was going to flip, but there was overwhelming Democratic turnout, and the House of Delegates ended up being completely tied, such that the marginal seat, the one that was going to determine who controlled the House of Delegates for the next 2 years, was there was one seat, and the number of votes in that district were completely tied. And so the House of Delegates was decided by a coin flip. And if one more person had turned out to vote, it would have altered, the entire course of the first half of Governor Northam's term. So we have tons of examples from recent history where just a few votes, Florida obviously in 2000 being another great example, where just a few votes or even one vote can make a difference. I think we need to talk about those stories more and remind people that this matters and that this has real implications for their lives.
Well, I know we're up to time, and the last question I was going to ask you was kind of what helps you be optimistic, but I think the work that you're engaged in proves that you're optimistic. I think optimism is really the expression in the belief that the future can be better than the present. And I don't think any of you would be engaged in the work you are with, especially millennial and Gen Z kind of counterparts, to help ensure that young people have kind of good information to make good decisions about kind of the environments where they want to work, hopefully the votes that they will cast at the ballot box, and what policies they want to champion, and how to engage one another in robust, honest, maybe sometimes wrenching, but always respectful dialogue. So just thank you all for what you're doing, and thank you for your conversation and wisdom this evening. And now I think I'm handing it back to Ishrat, who will help kind of shepherd us on to the next part of the program.
Awesome. Thank you, Chelsea. And I just wanted to say this has been an incredibly insightful conversation. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. And a special thanks to Chelsea and our incredible panelists for sharing all of their thoughtful reflections. I think if there's anything I've taken away, I think it's really that it's more urgent than ever now for our generation to really inform, engage, and start enforcing these conversations. And I think reviving this democracy is obviously of the utmost urgency now more than ever. So we hope that you really enjoyed this conversation and that it's inspired you to take some action in your own communities. And if you're interested and a current university student, please apply to the Up to Us program. The details are in a link in the chat. And now, if folks want to stick around, we're really excited to invite everyone to join us for some breakout discussions with the panelists and our fellow attendees. So the chat should also have some information on a few of the different key themes that we've discussed. And each of the rooms will be led by one of the panelists. So please go ahead and select a link to the breakout room that you would like to join. And again, a warm thank you to all of you for joining us today and keeping this conversation going.